The marble floors of Celestial Café gleamed under the afternoon soul sunlight as Lee So-young carefully balanced the silver tray in her hands. Her simple white uniform and pulled-back hair made her nearly invisible among the wealthy clientele who frequented this upscale establishment in Gangnam District. At table 7, Kang Min-jun commanded attention without effort. The 32-year-old CEO of Kang Industries sat like a king among his business associates, his perfectly tailored Armani suit and cold, calculating eyes reflecting his reputation as Seoul's most ruthless billionaire. His dark hair was styled with precision, and his angular jawline spoke of generations of privilege and power. "The merger will proceed as planned," Min-jun declared, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "Anyone who opposes this decision clearly lacks the intelligence to understand basic business strategy." So-young approached quietly, setting down expensive coffee cups with practiced grace. Her movements were fluid, almost dance-like, but she kept her eyes downcast as she'd learned to do in her 3 months working here. "Excuse me," Min-jun's sharp voice cut through the air like a blade. "You there, waitress?" So-young froze, her heart skipping a beat. She turned slowly, bowing respectfully. "Yes, sir." Min-jun's lips curved into a cruel smile as his associates chuckled. "I was just telling my colleagues about intelligence. Tell me, do you play any games that require thinking? Or is serving coffee the extent of your mental capabilities?" The question hung in the air like poison. So-young's fingers tightened imperceptibly around the empty tray, but her expression remained carefully neutral. She had learned long ago that silence was often the safest response to cruelty. "I thought so." Min-jun continued, his laughter cold and dismissive. "Some people are simply born to serve others." The humiliation burned in So-young's chest, but she maintained her composure with the skill of someone who had endured far worse. Around the cafe, other patrons had begun to notice the commotion, their conversations dying to whispers as they watched the scene unfold. Min-jun leaned back in his leather chair, clearly enjoying the attention. "You know what? I'm feeling generous today." He gestured grandly to his briefcase. "I have a chess set here. If you can beat me in a single game, I'll give you 1,000,000 won. Consider it charity." His associates erupted in laughter. "Min-jun, you're the Seoul University chess champion," one of them said. "That's hardly fair." "Fair?" Min-jun's eyes glittered with malice. "Life isn't fair. I'm simply demonstrating the natural order of things. Intelligence rises to the top while—" He looked So-young up and down dismissively. "Mediocrity serves coffee." So-young stood perfectly still, her mind racing. She thought of her small apartment, her mounting bills, her grandmother's medical expenses. She thought of the scholarship she'd lost, the dreams she'd abandoned, the genius she'd been forced to hide. 1,000,000 won? She asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's right. Easy money for someone of your caliber." Min-jun's smile was predatory. "Unless you're too afraid to lose publicly?" The cafe had gone completely silent now. Even the baristas had stopped working to watch. So-young could feel dozens of eyes on her, waiting for her response. She knew she should walk away, should return to her invisible existence serving the wealthy elite who looked through her as if she didn't exist. Instead, she set down her tray with deliberate care and looked directly into Kang Min-jun's cold, arrogant eyes. "I accept your challenge, sir." The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples that would change everything. Min-jun's eyebrows rose slightly, the only sign of his surprise. He had expected the waitress to scurry away in embarrassment, not accept his challenge. Around the cafe, murmurs of excitement and disbelief rippled through the crowd as word spread of the unusual confrontation. "Excellent," Min-jun said, his voice dripping with condescension. He snapped his fingers at one of his associates. "Clear the table. Let's make this quick so the poor girl can return to her duties." So-young watched as expensive documents and tablets were moved aside to make room for an ornate chess set. The pieces were carved from black and white marble, each one a work of art that probably cost more than she earned in 6 months. Min-jun arranged them with practiced efficiency, his movements confident and precise. "I'll be white," he announced, not bothering to ask her preference. Standard rules. No takebacks, no time limits. When you lose, I don't want to hear any excuses about not understanding the game. So Young took the seat across from him, her posture straight but relaxed. She studied the board with what appeared to be nervous uncertainty, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her apron. To the watching crowd, she looked like exactly what Min-jun had labeled her, an overwhelmed service worker about to be humiliated by her social superior. "Have you actually played before?" Min-jun asked, his tone suggesting he hoped the answer was no. "I'd hate for this to be completely one-sided." "A little," So Young replied softly, her eyes still downcast. "My grandfather taught me when I was young." Min-jun's associates exchanged knowing looks. This would be over quickly. The CEO was not just wealthy and powerful, he was genuinely brilliant, with an IQ that had earned him early admission to Seoul National University and a reputation as an unbeatable strategist in both business and chess. "How touching," Min-jun said, moving his king's pawn forward 2 spaces in the classic opening move. "Let's see what grandfather taught you." So Young stared at the board for a long moment, her brow furrowed in apparent concentration. The watching crowd grew restless, some checking their phones while others whispered about the obvious mismatch. Min-jun drummed his fingers impatiently on the marble table, already planning his victory speech. "Take your time," he said with mock patience. "Though I do have a board meeting in an hour." So Young's hand hovered over her pieces, trembling slightly. She touched her queen's pawn, then pulled back. She reached for a knight, hesitated, then withdrew her hand again. The performance was perfect, a nervous amateur overwhelmed by the situation. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she moved her king's pawn forward 1 square. The café erupted in barely suppressed laughter. Even the baristas were smirking now. It was perhaps the most timid, conservative opening move possible, the kind of play that screamed amateur to anyone who understood chess. "Interesting choice," Min-jun said, not bothering to hide his amusement. He responded immediately with the aggressive knight development, his piece landing with a sharp click against the marble board. Very cautious, but something nagged at the edge of his consciousness. There had been something about the way she'd moved, a precision in the placement, a certainty in the final motion that contradicted her earlier hesitation. He pushed the thought away. He was overthinking things. This was exactly what it appeared to be, a mismatch between a chess master and a café waitress. So Young made her second move quickly this time, developing her knight to a seemingly innocuous square. Again, it appeared conservative, almost defensive. Min-jun responded with textbook aggression, seizing central control of the board. "You're not making this very challenging," he commented, his voice carrying clearly through the silent café. "Are you sure you want to continue? I could always reduce the stakes to something more appropriate for your skill level." So Young looked up at him for the first time since the game began, her dark eyes meeting his with unexpected steadiness. "I prefer to finish what I start, sir." As the game progressed, Min-jun found himself growing increasingly confident. So Young's moves continued to appear hesitant and defensive, exactly what he'd expected from someone of her background. He captured her bishop with a flourish, adding it to his growing collection of conquered pieces. "Chess is really about understanding power dynamics," he explained to his audience, his voice taking on the lecturing tone he used in boardrooms. "You have to think several moves ahead, anticipate your opponent's weaknesses, and strike decisively when the opportunity presents itself." So Young nodded, as if absorbing this wisdom, her expression appropriately humble. She moved her remaining bishop to what appeared to be a retreat position, and Min-jun's smile widened. This was going exactly as he'd planned. "In business, as in chess, there are natural hierarchies," he continued, moving his queen into an aggressive position. "Some people are born to lead, to make the difficult decisions that shape society. Others," he glanced meaningfully at So Young, "are born to serve those leaders." The watching crowd murmured their agreement. This was the natural order they all understood, wealth and education triumphing over poverty and ignorance. Min-jun was not just winning a chess game, he was reinforcing the social structure that kept them all in their proper places. But then So-young made a move that caused Min-jun to pause. She advanced a pawn that he hadn't been paying attention to, and suddenly he realized it was threatening one of his knights. Not a serious threat. He could easily move the piece to safety, but it was the first genuinely aggressive move she'd made. "Ah," he said, moving his knight, finally showing some fighting spirit, though I'm afraid it's too little, too late. So-young's response was immediate this time, no hesitation at all. She moved her queen diagonally across the board, and suddenly Min-jun found himself looking at a position he didn't immediately understand. His confident smile faltered slightly as he studied the board more carefully. Min-jun stared at the chessboard, his mind working rapidly to analyze the new position. So-young's queen move had seemed random at first glance, but now he could see it was supporting a complex pawn structure he hadn't noticed developing. More troubling, he realized he'd been so focused on his own aggressive strategy that he'd failed to see the subtle trap she'd been constructing. Clever, he admitted grudgingly, though his tone suggested he still considered it a lucky accident. He moved his rook to what he believed was a strong attacking position, but even as he placed the piece, something felt wrong. So-young's next move came without hesitation. She captured one of his pawns with her knight, and suddenly the entire center of the board shifted in her favor. The watching crowd stirred uneasily, sensing that something unexpected was happening. "Interesting," Min-jun muttered, his earlier confidence beginning to crack. He studied the position more carefully now, his business associates leaning forward to get a better view of the board. For the first time since the game began, Min-jun found himself genuinely thinking about his next move. The position was more complex than he'd anticipated, and So-young's pieces were coordinating in ways that suggested a deeper understanding of chess strategy than her humble demeanor had indicated. He moved his bishop, attempting to regain control of the center, but So-young's response was immediate and devastating. She advanced another pawn, and suddenly Min-jun realized that his king was in a precarious position. "How did you—" he began, then caught himself. Around the cafe, the atmosphere had shifted from amused anticipation to genuine tension. The other patrons were no longer checking their phones. They were watching the board with growing fascination. So-young looked up at him, and for just a moment Min-jun caught a glimpse of something in her eyes, a sharp intelligence that seemed completely at odds with the submissive waitress persona she'd been projecting. "Is everything all right, sir?" she asked softly, her voice still carrying that same deferential tone. "You seem, concerned." The pretense was becoming harder to maintain. Min-jun found himself studying not just the chessboard but the woman across from him. Her fingers, he noticed, moved across the pieces with the same precision a pianist might use on a keyboard. Her eyes, when she looked at the board, held a calculating intensity that spoke of years of serious study. "Who are you?" he asked quietly, his voice barely audible above the cafe's ambient noise. So-young tilted her head slightly, as if confused by the question. "I'm sorry, sir?" But Min-jun was no longer listening to her words. He was watching her hands as she made her next move, a queen sacrifice that left him staring at the board in complete bewilderment. It was the kind of move that required not just skill, but genuine brilliance, the ability to see patterns and possibilities that existed several moves in the future. The cafe had gone completely silent now. Even his business associates had stopped their whispered commentary, sensing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Min-jun's reputation as an unbeatable chess player was well known in their circles, and yet this quiet waitress was systematically dismantling his position. "This isn't possible," one of his associates whispered. "She's just a—" "Don't!" Min-jun cut him off sharply, his eyes never leaving the board. He was beginning to understand that everything he'd assumed about this woman had been wrong. The hesitation, the timid moves, the deferential manner. It had all been an act, a carefully constructed performance designed to lull him into overconfidence. He moved his king to safety, but even as he did so, he could see that it was only delaying the inevitable. So-young's pieces were positioned with mathematical precision, each one serving multiple purposes in a grand strategy that was only now becoming clear to him. "You've been playing me from the beginning," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. So-young looked up at him, and this time she didn't bother to hide the intelligence in her eyes. "Yes, sir, I have." The admission hung in the air like a challenge. Around them, the cafe patrons leaned forward, sensing that they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple chess game. Min-jun felt a strange mixture of emotions: anger at being deceived, admiration for the skill required to deceive him so completely, and something else he couldn't quite identify. "You're not just a waitress," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his mind. So-young made another move, her queen dancing across the board to a position that threatened multiple pieces simultaneously. "I am a waitress, sir. I serve coffee. I clean tables. I smile politely at customers who treat me as if I'm invisible." "That part is entirely true. But you're also something else. I'm also someone who needed a job to pay for my grandmother's medical treatments," she replied, her voice taking on a harder edge. "Someone who lost her scholarship to Seoul National University when her parents died in a car accident. Someone who had to choose between pursuing her dreams and keeping her family alive." Min-jun felt something twist in his chest, an unfamiliar sensation that took him a moment to recognize as guilt. He looked at the woman across from him with new eyes, seeing not just the brilliant chess player, but the person behind the performance. "Seoul National University," he repeated slowly. "What was your major?" "Mathematics and computer science. I was working on my thesis in game theory when—" She gestured vaguely, encompassing the cafe, her uniform, her current circumstances. Life had other plans. She moved her rook, and suddenly Min-jun could see the endgame approaching with mathematical certainty. In 3 moves, maybe 4, his king would be in checkmate. There was no escape, no clever tactical solution that could save him. "You could have told me," he said quietly. "You could have explained your situation instead of this." So-young's laugh was soft but bitter. "Would you have listened? Or would you have assumed I was lying, trying to manipulate you for money?" Min-jun opened his mouth to protest, then closed it. He knew the answer, and so did she. Min-jun stared at the board, his mind racing through possibilities that didn't exist. Every potential move led to the same inevitable conclusion. So-young had woven a trap so elegant, so perfectly constructed, that he could only admire its artistry, even as it destroyed him. "Checkmate in 3 moves," he said quietly, his voice carrying a note of wonder. "2, actually," So-young corrected gently. "You missed the knight fork." He looked again and saw she was right. The position was even more hopeless than he'd realized. Around them, the cafe had erupted in whispers and exclamations as word spread of the impossible upset. The arrogant billionaire, defeated by a waitress in front of dozens of witnesses. Min-jun reached out and tipped over his king, the marble piece falling with a soft click against the board. "I resign." The words seemed to echo in the sudden silence. So-young sat back in her chair, her performance finally complete. The submissive waitress was gone, replaced by a woman of obvious intelligence and dignity. "The 1,000,000 won," Min-jun said, reaching for his wallet. His hands, he noticed, were trembling slightly. "Keep it," So-young said, standing gracefully. "I didn't do this for the money." "Then why?" She looked down at him, and for the first time since the game began, her expression was completely unguarded. "Because sometimes people need to be reminded that intelligence and worth aren't determined by bank accounts or job titles. Because everyone deserves to be seen as more than their circumstances." She picked up her serving tray, transforming back into the invisible waitress with practiced ease. "Your coffee is getting cold, sir. Shall I bring you a fresh cup?" Min-jun watched her walk away, his mind reeling from everything that had just happened. Around him, his business associates sat in stunned silence, unsure how to process what they'd witnessed. For the first time in his adult life, Kang Min-jun found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about the world. That night, Min-jun stood in his penthouse apartment overlooking the Han River, but the glittering Seoul skyline held none of its usual appeal. The chess game replayed endlessly in his mind, not just the moves, but the moments when he'd seen past So-young's carefully constructed facade to the brilliant woman beneath. He'd built his life on the assumption that success was a measure of worth, that his wealth and power proved his superiority over those who served him. But in the space of an hour, a cafe waitress had shattered that worldview with nothing more than 32 chess pieces and a mind sharper than his own. Sleep eluded him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, not the submissive mask she wore for customers, but the fierce intelligence that had blazed in her eyes when she'd finally dropped her pretense. He found himself wondering about her story, about the dreams she'd sacrificed, about the grandmother whose medical bills had forced a genius to serve coffee to people who couldn't see her worth. The next morning, Min-jun arrived at his office early, but concentration proved impossible. His assistant noticed his distraction during the morning briefing, and his board members exchanged concerned glances when he approved a merger proposal without his usual ruthless analysis. "Sir?" His secretary's voice cut through his thoughts. "The quarterly reports are ready for your review." Min-jun looked up from his desk, where he'd been unconsciously sketching chess positions on his notepad. "Cancel my appointments for today." "All of them, sir. You have the Hanwha Industries meeting at 2 and the Charity Gala Planning Committee at 4. "All of them." Min-jun stood abruptly, grabbing his jacket. "I have something more important to do." 20 minutes later, he stood outside Celestial Café, his heart pounding with an emotion he couldn't name. Through the large windows, he could see So-young moving between tables with the same graceful efficiency he'd observed the day before, her true self once again hidden behind the mask of professional servility. Min-jun entered the cafe with uncharacteristic hesitation, his usual commanding presence subdued. So-young noticed him immediately but showed no reaction beyond a polite nod of acknowledgement. She finished taking an order from a nearby table before approaching him, her expression carefully neutral. "Good morning, sir. Your usual table." "Actually," Min-jun said, his voice quieter than usual, "I was hoping we could talk. Privately." So-young glanced around the busy cafe, then back at him. "I'm working, sir. Perhaps another time." "I spoke with your manager this morning," Min-jun interrupted. "You have a break in 10 minutes, please. Just give me that much." Something in his tone made her pause. This wasn't the arrogant billionaire who had humiliated her yesterday. This was someone else entirely. She nodded slowly. 10 minutes. They met in the small employee break room behind the cafe, a cramped space with mismatched furniture and fluorescent lighting that made everything look harsh and unforgiving. So-young sat across from him, her posture guarded. "I've been thinking about yesterday," Min-jun began, then stopped, struggling to find words for thoughts he'd never had to articulate before. "About what you said, about being seen. And I want to offer you a job at my company, research and development, game theory applications and business strategy. The salary would be..." He named a figure that made So-young's eyes widen despite herself. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Because you're brilliant. Because you're wasted here. Because..." He stopped, frustrated by his inability to express the complex emotions churning inside him. "Because I was wrong about you. About everything." So-young studied his face, searching for signs of deception or manipulation. "What makes you think I'd want to work for someone who treated me the way you did yesterday?" The question hit him like a physical blow. "I don't know," he admitted. I hope you might give me a chance to prove I can be better than that." So-young was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the break room table. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but steady. "Do you know what it's like to be invisible? To have people look right through you as if you don't exist?" Min-jun started to respond, then stopped. He realized he didn't know, had never even considered it. "Every day, I serve coffee to people who make more in an hour than I make in a month," she continued. "They discuss business deals worth millions while I clean up their messes. They talk about me as if I can't hear them, as if I'm not even human. So young, I'm not finished." Her voice carried a quiet authority that made him fall silent. Yesterday, you didn't just challenge me to a chess game. You tried to humiliate me in front of a room full of people. You wanted to prove that I was less than you, that my life had less value than yours. The words cut deep, because they were true. Min-jun felt shame wash over him, an emotion so foreign he barely recognized it. "You're right," he said quietly. "I did want to humiliate you. I wanted to reinforce my own sense of superiority by making you feel small. It was cruel and unnecessary, and I'm sorry." So Young looked surprised by the directness of his admission. "Why are you apologizing?" "Because you showed me something yesterday that I'd never seen before. You showed me that intelligence and worth have nothing to do with circumstances or social position. You made me realize that I've been living my entire life based on a lie." He leaned forward, his eyes intense. "I don't just want to offer you a job, So Young. I want to learn from you. I want to understand how someone can maintain their dignity and brilliance even when the world tries to make them invisible." For the first time since they'd sat down, So Young's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. "You really mean that?" "I do." She was quiet again, considering. "The job offer, it's not charity. It's the smartest business decision I could make. My company needs someone with your mind." 3 weeks later, So Young walked through the gleaming corridors of Kang Industries, her heels clicking against the marble floors with newfound confidence. The transformation was remarkable. Gone was the invisible waitress, replaced by a poised professional in an elegant business suit that spoke of both competence and dignity. Min-jun watched her from his office window as she settled into her new workspace, surrounded by computer monitors and whiteboards covered in complex mathematical equations. The research and development team had welcomed her with a mixture of curiosity and respect, especially after her first presentation had solved a logistics problem that had been plaguing them for months. "She's extraordinary," his assistant commented following his gaze. "The team says she thinks about problems in ways they've never considered." Min-jun nodded, but his attention wasn't entirely on So Young's professional capabilities. Over the past weeks, he'd found himself looking forward to their daily strategy meetings with an anticipation that had nothing to do with business. There was something about her presence that made him want to be better than he'd ever been before. "Sir?" His assistant's voice brought him back to the present. "Your 2 o'clock appointment is here." "Right. Send them in." But even as he turned to face his next meeting, Min-jun's thoughts remained with the woman who had challenged everything he believed about himself and the world. The chess game had been just the beginning. Now he found himself engaged in a far more complex game, one where the stakes were not money or pride, but the possibility of becoming the kind of man who deserved someone like Lee So-young. That evening, as the office emptied and the Seoul skyline began to twinkle with lights, Min-jun found himself walking past So-young's desk. She was still there, absorbed in her work, her brow furrowed in concentration as she worked through a particularly challenging algorithm. "You don't have to stay so late," he said softly. She looked up, startled. "Oh, I didn't realize you were still here. I could say the same about you." She smiled, and Min-jun felt his heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with business strategy. 6 months after their first chess game, Min-jun and So-young stood on the rooftop garden of Kang Industries, the city spreading out below them like a circuit board of lights and possibilities. The company's quarterly results had exceeded all projections, thanks in large part to So-young's innovative approaches to market analysis and strategic planning. "I have something for you," Min-jun said, pulling a small wrapped package from his jacket pocket. So-young accepted it with curiosity, carefully unwrapping the elegant paper to reveal a chess set. Not the ostentatious marble pieces from the café, but a simple wooden set with pieces worn smooth by countless games. "It was my grandfather's," Min-jun explained. "He taught me to play when I was 7. I thought you might like to have it." So-young ran her fingers over the carved pieces, feeling the weight of history and sentiment in the simple gift. "It's beautiful. He used to tell me that chess wasn't really about winning or losing," Min-jun continued, his voice soft. He said it was about understanding your opponent, seeing the world through their eyes, finding the humanity in the competition. Wise man. I didn't understand what he meant then. I thought chess was just another way to prove superiority, to demonstrate dominance. Min-jun moved closer, his eyes reflecting the city lights. You taught me what he was really trying to say. So Young looked up at him, seeing not the arrogant billionaire who had tried to humiliate her, but the man who had learned to question his assumptions, to value intelligence over status, to see worth in places he'd never thought to look. So Young, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, I know I have no right to ask this considering how we met, but would you give me a chance? Not as your employer, not as someone trying to make amends for past mistakes, but as a man who's fallen in love with the most extraordinary woman he's ever met. The question hung between them, like a chess move waiting to be made. So Young studied his face, seeing vulnerability where once there had been only arrogance, genuine emotion where there had been calculated manipulation. Checkmate, she said softly, then smiled as confusion crossed his features. That's what this is, isn't it? You've maneuvered me into a position where I can't say no. So Young, I would never. She silenced him with a gentle touch to his lips. I'm not complaining. Sometimes the best strategies are the ones that lead to surrender. As Min-jun leaned down to kiss her, So Young reflected on the strange game that had brought them together. She had won their chess match, but in the end, they had both discovered something far more valuable than victory, the possibility of love that sees beyond surface appearances to the truth beneath. In the distance, Seoul hummed with the energy of millions of lives intersecting and diverging, each person playing their own complex game of survival and hope. But on the rooftop of Kang Industries, two players had finally found their perfect match.